The very first thing Barthes explained his camera lucida was what the photographs reproduced to infinite has occurred only once. Thus, in this particular moment, I want to capture the moment of death of one highly reputable thinker in my faculty in Indonesia. Professor Sutanyo Wingyo Subroto passed away a few weeks ago. He was an emeritus professor in the Faculty of Social and Political Science. After battling with age and terminal illness, he has to give up and died peacefully accompanied by his family. Barthes stating that the photograph is never anything but an antiphon of look. The photograph always carries its reference with itself. I was not a photographer, and I was not the photographer of these pictures, but I could feel the general mourning which accompanies Professor Sutanyo's memorial service. Referring to what Barthes said back in Camera Lucida, I have the freedom to interpret what these pictures means to me, more than just an informational meaning and or a symbolic meaning. The obvious meaning may remain revolutionary, but the death of Professor Sutanyo has a historical meaning for me. Three levels of meaning introduced by Barthes basically describes how a photograph could have an informational, a symbolic, and an obtuse meaning. I see these pictures with a multi-layering of meanings. The previous meaning I had continue as I move from one picture to another. Photography is a limited possession. In this picture, I could see a student try to be strong either physically or emotionally to hold the pictures which he is responsible with. Barthes explains that in a picture, there is an evident, erratic, and obstinate. That is why in the very beginning, when I talk about Barthes' camera lucida, photography was being intended to advertise a status. Who are you, what is your role, and what is your part in this story? Photography transforms subject into an object, and even one might say into a museum of objects. These pictures to me represent that very subtle moment of death. The photographer's organ is not the eye according to Barthes, it's their finger. When to push the button, which moment will they capture? Significance in Barthes' third meaning has the advantage of referring to the field of the signifier and not a signification. According to Barthes, the photograph itself is in no way animated, but it animates us, and this is what creates every moment. As photography is a kind of primitive theater, Barthes also argued that the mask is the meaning. These pictures has a lot of mask. The obvious meaning has become the third meaning that goes beyond what they wore in the ceremony or how was the expression during the burial moment. As people try to engage in an effort of descriptions, Barthes argues in Camera Lucida that they will always miss its point of effect, the punctum. Again, Barthes stating that the obvious meaning appears to extend outside culture, knowledge, and information. Reading these photographs, what moves me is the gesture. As Barthes was also realizing the real punctum could accommodate a certain latency, Barthes' last remarks about the punctum is whether or not it is triggered or it is an addition. It is what I add to the photograph. The punctum, nonetheless, is already there. In connection with the noble grief of the obvious meaning, referring to Barthes in his third meaning article, these pictures form a dialogue. It declares its artifice, but without in so doing abandoning the good faith of its referent, which is me. On account of their sadness for me, whole portrayal of grief endowed with an unlocatable punctum, as punctum denotes as it is wounding, personal touching detail which establishes a direct relationship with the object and or the person. This is the punctum. The punctum fantastically brings out the grief nature of the photograph. It endows this photograph with a blind field referring to Barthes. Thus, I must say that the photograph does indeed portray some grief feeling. However, the unlocatable punctum was the sadness. The closing ground. As they finish burying the body into the grave, there is this disruptive force which creates the whole of the obtuse meaning. Barthes stating that the obtuse meaning carries a certain emotion, and I was constantly informed by something loving or dear to me. Barthes argued that we could read an obtuse meaning, something that I can't manage to describe only to the signed allocation. as I remember again when Barthes emphasized that the obtuse meaning is not situated structurally. The obtuse meaning is a signifier without a signified, hence the difficulty in naming it. I was speechless when I see this picture. It was just sadness. Barthes again said that the obtuse meaning is outside articulate language while nevertheless within the interlocution. Obtuse meaning appears necessarily as a luxury, an expenditure without no exchange. I see this picture as the new home for Professor Sutanjo. After all, while the obvious meaning of this photograph may seem fully thematic, the obtuse meaning can only come and go. It appearing and disappearing, according to Barthes. Death can be a luxury from the flower, from the prayer, from the thought that comes from this prayer. But death can also be misery from the tears, from the sobbing family, and this narrative may be necessary to be understood for the lost.